Mike's worn-out sneakers slapped against the cracked pavement as he made his way to his car, a faint sigh escaping his lips. The sound of tires squealing and engines revving was all around him, but he barely noticed. There was nothing new about today, nothing that would make it stand out. Another day in the grind. Every morning felt the same faded sun creeping over the skyline, the same empty feeling in his stomach. His business, Mike's Auto Repairs, was barely keeping the lights on. His old garage had long since faded from the kind of place you'd bring a car for a quick fix to a spot you'd avoid if you valued your time or money. But it was his, and it was all he had. His fingers ran along the rough fabric of his jacket as he approached the ancient sedan he called a car. The engine sputtered like it had a mind of its own, but it still started, just barely. Mike had grown used to the sound. It was a reminder that he didn't have the luxury of upgrades, of new cars, new opportunities. The bills piled up at home. The repairs and overdue payments stacked like a fortress he was losing the battle against. His eyes briefly drifted to the side, catching the gleam of something foreign, something that could have been taken out of a dream. The dealership, just a block from his shop. The Lamborghinis, the Ferraris, the cars that whispered success to anyone who dared to dream of them. Mike didn't even slow down anymore. There was no point. The cars might as well have been part of another world, a world that didn't have to worry about how to pay rent or where the next meal was coming from. He didn't belong there. Still, a small part of him, a small, almost guilty part, lingered on those cars each time. He couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to have that kind of freedom. But as the sound of his engine roared to life, that thought faded. He had work to do. Inside his small shop, the clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m. Mike rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The tools were rusty, the space cramped, but it was familiar. His hands moved with practiced ease as he welded a broken exhaust pipe together. His mind, however, was elsewhere. He had always been kind, maybe too kind for his own good. People didn't always appreciate that about him. In his younger years, he had been burned by trusting the wrong people, doing favors for those who never returned the favor. It was the kind of thing that left a scar but didn't kill you. It just made you cautious, made you keep your distance, keep your trust locked up tight in a vault no one could crack. Still, there were days when the kindness inside him wanted to break free, to see the world differently again. But today, like every day, he was more focused on keeping the lights on than worrying about the world outside his repair shop. As he worked, he thought about the phone call he had to make later, a debt collector, most likely. And just as his thoughts began to slip into a spiral, the bell above the door jingled. A customer. Mike wiped his hands on his rag and stood up. Another day, another problem to fix. Another reminder of how far away that world of sleek cars and easy money felt. But sometimes, life has a way of introducing change when you least expect it. Mike's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror as the rain started to fall harder. The streetlights stretched long, casting eerie shadows against the wet pavement. He was tired, exhausted, really. Another long day at the shop. Another round of customers who couldn't quite pay the full price. Another hour spent negotiating, trying to stretch what little he had just to stay afloat. As he turned the corner onto the deserted back road that led home, the headlights of his beat-up car cut through the misty rain, barely illuminating the wet asphalt ahead. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the world feel heavy, like the weight of the day had settled over everything. And then, through the haze of rain and fog, he saw him. A figure on the side of the road. A man, standing under the dim glow of a streetlight, thumb extended, looking like he'd been waiting for hours. Mike's hand tightened around the steering wheel. The old instincts kicked in. He didn't pick up hitchhikers. Too risky. Too many stories about people who got into the wrong car, never to be heard from again. He knew better than to trust strangers. But then the man shifted, and something in his posture made Mike hesitate. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't desperate. Just calm. Almost resigned. Mike slowed down, the rain tapping harder against the windshield. He knew what his conscience would say if he just drove past. You could help him, Mike. It's not like you're on a tight schedule. With a sigh, he pulled over, rolling down the passenger window just enough to speak. The man approached the car, his face weathered, but not unkind. His clothes were worn, the edges of his jacket frayed, and his boots were scuffed from what seemed like miles of travel. His hair, a bit too long and messy, hung over his forehead as he smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Mike asked, trying to sound less awkward than he felt. The man's voice was calm, controlled, like he had been through a lot but wasn't about to make a fuss. "I'm heading towards a small town up the road. Thought I might catch a ride." Mike's brow furrowed. "Where exactly?" The man shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "Doesn't really matter. I've been moving around for a while." He paused for a moment, looking at Mike as if weighing something. "Sometimes we get too busy to notice the world around us. You'd be surprised how many people pass by without a second thought." Mike didn't quite know how to respond to that. The rain was coming down harder now, splashing against the windows, but Mike found himself leaning slightly out the window, listening. There was something about this stranger, something in his tone that made Mike feel like he should listen. "I guess you're right," Mike said, his voice a little softer than usual. He wasn't sure why, but the words seemed to come out on their own. The man gave him a grateful look before nodding toward the passenger door. "Thanks, I appreciate it." Mike unlocked the door and let the man in, a little surprised at how easy it was to make the decision. They drove in silence for a while, the rain hammering against the roof of the car, the steady hum of the engine filling the space between them. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice breaking through the quiet. "You know, most people would have kept driving. They think they're too busy to stop, or they just don't want to bother. They forget that a simple act of kindness can change someone's day." Mike glanced over, curious but still cautious. "Yeah, well, we've all got our own things to worry about, right?" The man nodded slowly, but his eyes, though weary, held a certain understanding. "True, but you never know when someone's kindness might change the course of your life." Mike felt a strange unease wash over him, though he couldn't put his finger on why. The stranger's words hung in the air, like a mystery waiting to be solved. But for now, there was nothing to do but drive on, letting the rhythm of the road take them forward. They continued down the road, the rain still coming down in sheets, each mile bringing them closer to whatever waited ahead. As the miles ticked by, the rain started to let up, and the road ahead grew clearer. The car's tires made a rhythmic swoosh against the wet pavement, and the steady hum of the engine was the only sound between Mike and the stranger. "Looks like we're almost there," Mike said, glancing over at the man in the passenger seat, who had remained mostly quiet during the drive. The stranger, Daniel, as Mike had learned, nodded, his eyes distant, as if he was already lost in thought. He didn't seem in a hurry to leave, yet he'd been polite and respectful since he'd gotten in. Mike figured they were getting close enough for him to drop Daniel off at the small town nearby. They neared the edge of the town, the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the mist as they approached a little motel at the side of the road. but just as Mike slowed down to make the turn, Daniel suddenly looked panicked, reaching into his pockets and then patting the seat beside him. Mike raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" Daniel's face was a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. I think I left my wallet at the last place I stayed," he admitted, his voice laced with genuine regret. "I don't have any cash. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you in a position like this." Mike blinked, surprised at the honesty in Daniel's voice. He was about to say something when Daniel quickly added, "I can walk from here." "It's fine." But Mike shook his head, feeling something inside him shift. He could have just dropped Daniel off at the motel and left, but the look on the man's face made him pause. "It's no big deal," Mike said with a shrug, even as his mind turned over the thought of being a little late getting home. "You're probably hungry. I'll stop at the gas station up ahead." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "Really? You don't have to—" "I'm already here," Mike cut him off, pulling the car over at the small, run-down gas station on the corner. The lights buzzed faintly in the night, and the place had the same tired look as everything else in the area. Mike turned off the engine and got out, walking into the station while Daniel stayed in the car, leaning his head against the window, watching the rain fade into mist. When Mike came back, he had a small bag of chips, a candy bar, and a bottle of water in his hand. "This should be enough to tide you over," Mike said, handing the snacks to Daniel. He hesitated for a second before adding, "Here, take this. It's not much, but it'll help you get by until you sort things out." Daniel looked down at the cash in his hand, only a small amount, but enough to cover a meal or a bus ticket. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to take it. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, his voice more sincere than before. I don't know what to say." Mike gave him a small nod. "No need to thank me. Just pass it forward when you can." Daniel's eyes softened as he took the money, folding it carefully in his hand. "I'll repay you one day, I promise." Mike smiled lightly, not expecting anything in return. He had learned over the years that sometimes doing the right thing was its own reward. "No need to worry about that," Mike replied. "Just take care of yourself." They both sat there for a moment, a brief silence between them before Daniel slowly opened the door and stepped out onto the wet pavement. "Thanks again," Daniel said, this time with a deep, genuine look of appreciation in his eyes. He turned toward the motel, walking off into the dimly lit night. Mike watched him for a second before starting the car, ready to head home. The rain had stopped for now, and the road was quiet again. He didn't expect to see Daniel again, but something about the encounter stuck with him. And for the rest of the night, as Mike drove through the empty roads back to his small home, he couldn't help but think about the man he'd just helped, and whether or not he'd truly see him again. Mike's day started just like any other. He woke to the sound of his alarm ringing too early, the dull thrum of his aging car engine reminding him of the long road ahead. He threw on his usual work clothes, a bit wrinkled from last night's rest, and grabbed the lukewarm coffee he'd left brewing on the counter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through another morning. The drive to the shop was quiet, the road stretching out ahead in the same predictable pattern. Mike's mind was focused on the usual worries. Overdue bills, the latest customer who couldn't quite pay the full price, and whether he'd have enough money for gas by the end of the week. Nothing unusual. But then, as he pulled up to his house, his eyes caught something strange. A car, a sleek black Lamborghini, sitting right in front of his modest home. Mike's foot hovered over the brake pedal, his heart skipping a beat. He was sure he was seeing things. He rubbed his eyes, but the car was still there, shining under the morning sun, looking completely out of place. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, slowing down. Was it a promotional stunt? a mistake. Maybe someone had parked it here by accident. But when he turned into his driveway, he saw a man stepping out of the car, straightening his suit as if he were used to walking out of expensive vehicles. He wore a pair of sunglasses, his expression unreadable behind them, but there was something familiar about the way he moved. Then it clicked. Mike's breath caught in his chest as the man turned toward him, a smile forming on his lips. It was him, Daniel, the man from last night, the stranger he'd picked up on the side of the road, the one he had helped with snacks and a little cash. The same guy, but now, he didn't look like the man Mike had given a ride to. "Mike," Daniel called out, his voice smooth, but there was an undeniable warmth in it. "I told you I'd repay your kindness." Mike froze, the words hanging in the air between them. The Lamborghini, the suit, the sunglasses, none of it made sense. How could this be the same man he had helped? Daniel took a few steps closer, still smiling. "It's been a while," he said. "I've been meaning to thank you properly for what you did for me." Mike was still standing there, his mind trying to process everything. What is all this?" His voice was barely a whisper, still trying to make sense of the impossible situation. Daniel's smile softened as he took a step closer. "It's a little unexpected, I know, but I'm here now, and I haven't forgotten." Mike felt his stomach tighten. There were so many questions, so many things he couldn't piece together. How could a man who had seemed so ordinary, so down on his luck, suddenly be standing here with a car like that? What was going on? But the one thing Mike couldn't deny was that something had changed. Something that had started with a simple act of kindness, and now it was spiraling into something he couldn't understand. Mike stood there, staring at Daniel in disbelief. The man, who had seemed so humble, so ordinary just the night before, was now standing before him, looking every bit like someone who belonged in a world Mike could only dream of. The Lamborghini, the tailored suit, the confidence in his voice. It didn't add up. "Wait, hold on," Mike said, trying to process it all. "You're telling me you're not just some random guy I helped out yesterday." He gestured to the car, still parked outside his modest home, as if it were the proof of the strange turn of events. Daniel chuckled softly, his expression remaining calm. "No, Mike, I'm not just some guy. I'm the CEO of a luxury automobile company." He paused for a moment, watching Mike's reaction. "This car, it's just one of many I've helped create." Mike's eyebrows shot up. He shook his head in disbelief, trying to make sense of what Daniel was saying. "So, you're telling me you've been pretending to be, homeless? Just to test me?" His voice was laced with skepticism, his hands tense at his sides. Daniel nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's exactly it. I wanted to see if people would be kind, even when they didn't know who I really was. I've always wondered how far a little generosity could go." He paused, his tone turning a bit more serious. "I've spent my life building a company, but I've seen too many people forget what really matters, what it means to help someone when they don't expect anything in return." Mike shook his head slowly, still trying to process the situation. This sounds like some kind of scam," he muttered under his breath. His mind was racing. How could anyone pull something like this off? Why would he be involved in something like this? Daniel watched him closely, his expression remaining unchanged. "If you don't believe me, Mike, why don't you take it for a drive?" He pointed toward the Lamborghini, still gleaming under the morning sun. "The papers are in the glove compartment. You'll see for yourself." Mike's heart skipped a beat. The idea of driving that car, a car he could never afford, a car that seemed like something out of a dream, was almost too surreal to consider. But even more than the car, the question hung in the air. Why was Daniel doing this? Why had he chosen Mike? Still uncertain, Mike glanced at the Lamborghini, his thoughts in turmoil. The doubts were swirling. Something about the whole situation felt off, like there was something he wasn't being told. But the car, the idea of driving it, feeling its power beneath him, was almost too tempting. Daniel, as if reading his mind, simply smiled and waited, his hands casually in his pockets. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of challenge. "Take it for a spin. You'll see I'm not lying." Mike hesitated, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than his doubts. The decision loomed before him, and for the first time in a long while, Mike wondered if maybe he was about to take a leap into something that could change his life forever. Mike sat in the driver's seat of the Lamborghini, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the seat. The leather was soft, the dashboard sleek, and the smell of the car, fresh, new, was intoxicating. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the power beneath him, the engine rumbling to life with a roar that made his heart race. He pulled out of his driveway, slowly at first, but soon the car's smooth handling and the rush of speed made him feel like he was soaring. For a moment, it was like the world had slowed down, and Mike was in a dream. It felt like everything he'd ever worked for, every struggle, every sacrifice, had led him to this one perfect moment. The car was a symbol of something he had longed for, a life beyond the bills, the debts, and the endless grind. But just as quickly, doubts crept in. The exhilaration faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a weight in his chest. Was he being foolish? What if this was some kind of trick? What if Daniel was testing him again, playing a game with him to see how far he would go? Mike's mind raced as he drove, torn between the thrill of the Lamborghini and the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. The car, the kindness, the sudden appearance of wealth, it all seemed too perfect, too unreal. After a short drive, he pulled back into his driveway, his heart still beating fast. But now it wasn't from the speed. It was from the uncertainty. As he parked the Lamborghini, Mike noticed a group of neighbors standing near the street, whispering and pointing at him. Their eyes followed him as he got out of the car, some of them shaking their heads, others talking among themselves in hushed tones. Mike could feel their eyes on him, and an uneasy knot formed in his stomach. He had always been the quiet, humble guy in the neighborhood. He worked hard, kept to himself, and never tried to stand out. Now, with a luxury car parked in front of his modest house, it felt like the spotlight was on him, and he wasn't sure if he liked it. "What are they thinking?" Mike muttered to himself, his gaze shifting between the car and his neighbors. He could hear their whispers, some of them no doubt wondering where he had gotten the car, others possibly wondering if he had won the lottery or gotten into some shady deal. His mind wandered back to Daniel. Was this all too good to be true? Why had Daniel chosen him? Was he really just trying to repay a small act of kindness? Or was there something more to this offer? Something he wasn't telling Mike? Mike suddenly felt exposed, like the attention was too much to handle. The Lamborghini, once a symbol of something he'd never imagined for himself, now felt like a burden, something that could bring more trouble than joy. He glanced back at his house, then at his neighbors. The questions they had, the suspicions, they were starting to eat away at him. "What if this isn't real?" Mike whispered under his breath. "What if I'm just being set up?" The next day, as Mike sat at the kitchen table, his mind still racing from the strange events that had unfolded, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. His heart skipped a beat as he looked out the window. It was Daniel again, the same black Lamborghini parked just behind his own beat-up car. This time, Daniel stepped out of the vehicle with a serious look on his face, as if he knew something was weighing heavily on Mike's mind. Mike met him outside, unsure of what to expect. His nerves were on edge, and the lingering questions from yesterday hadn't gone away. He felt exposed, like he was in over his head, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever new revelation Daniel was about to drop on him. Daniel looked at Mike with a knowing expression. "I can tell you're still thinking about yesterday," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And I understand why. This has all been a bit overwhelming, hasn't it?" Mike hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's hard to believe. I've been trying to figure out what your angle is. Why me? Why this car? Why all this generosity?" Daniel smiled faintly, as if Mike had just asked the one question he'd been expecting. He leaned against the Lamborghini, his hands casually resting in his pockets. "I can't blame you for being skeptical, but I'm not here to make you doubt yourself. In fact, I'm here to explain why I chose you." Mike listened closely, trying to suppress the growing anxiety in his chest. He needed answers. Daniel's face softened as he began to share a story Mike hadn't anticipated. "Years ago, I was in a completely different place. I was homeless, with nothing but the clothes on my back. I'd lost everything: my job, my family, my dignity. I was living on the streets, barely scraping by, until one day a stranger offered me food. It wasn't much, just a sandwich and some water, but it was everything I needed at the time. That simple act of kindness gave me hope. It showed me that there was still good in the world, even when things felt hopeless." Mike blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. The man standing before him, the CEO, the millionaire, had once been just like anyone else who was struggling. He felt a pang of empathy for Daniel, the man who had been where Mike was now, stressed, uncertain, and weighed down by life. "That moment changed everything for me," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. "It inspired me to turn my life around. I worked hard, built my company from the ground up, and every step of the way, I remembered that stranger's kindness. I knew I wanted to do something to pay that forward, to find people like him, people who help others without expecting anything in return." Mike was stunned. "So, this whole thing, this car, the test, it's all part of some kind of experiment?" Daniel nodded, his gaze firm. "Exactly. I've been looking for people who are truly kind, who don't act out of selfishness or expectation. And you, Mike, you passed that test. You helped me without asking for anything. That's rare." Mike stood silent, his mind reeling. He had no idea where to go from here. The weight of the situation seemed even heavier now, and Daniel's words kept echoing in his mind. Daniel took a step closer, his tone shifting. "I've got an offer for you. You can keep the car as a thank you for your kindness. But I'm also offering you something more, something far more valuable. But that's your choice. The car, or the other option." Mike felt his stomach churn. The idea of keeping the Lamborghini was tempting, but the mention of something more valuable made him pause. What could be more valuable than a car worth more than his entire house? What was Daniel really offering? He stood there, torn, the decision feeling heavier than anything he'd ever had to make before. Mike stood there, his mind in turmoil, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The Lamborghini gleamed in the sunlight, its sleek lines and polished surface a symbol of everything he'd ever wanted. The idea of keeping it, of finally having something that could change his life, was so tempting that his hands almost reached out for the keys in Daniel's hand. But then Daniel's words echoed in Mike's mind. You can keep the car, or you can have something even more valuable. What could possibly be more valuable than a car like this? Mike shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze flickering back and forth between the Lamborghini and Daniel, who was watching him intently. How can I choose? Mike finally asked, his voice heavy with doubt. How do I know what's really more valuable? Daniel smiled, but it wasn't the confident smile from before. This one was more knowing, more patient. Sometimes, Daniel said, his voice calm and steady, the greatest rewards aren't material things. They're not things you can buy or hold in your hand. They're the things that change your life in ways you don't expect. Mike frowned, trying to make sense of the cryptic answer. What could be more valuable than a car, or money, or the kind of freedom that came with wealth? He glanced back at the car. The Lamborghini wasn't just a car to him. It was a symbol of escape from his struggles, from the endless cycle of debt and worry. But the more he thought about Daniel's words, the more he realized that maybe this wasn't about the car at all. Maybe it was about something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or status. Mike felt a strange shift in his chest. His instincts told him that this was a moment he couldn't let slip by. It wasn't about the car. It was about trusting something beyond himself. Something he didn't fully understand yet. Taking a deep breath, Mike finally made his decision. I choose the other reward, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. I'm ready for whatever comes next. Daniel's eyes lit up with approval. Good choice, he said quietly. You've passed the final test. Let's see where it takes you. Mike didn't know what to expect next, but in that moment, something inside him shifted. It was as if he had opened the door to a new chapter in his life, one where he was no longer afraid of the unknown. And with that, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the greatest rewards often came when you least expected them. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. The heavy weight of it seemed to add to the tension in the air. He handed it to Mike with a calm smile, his eyes locked on Mike's face, as if waiting for the moment to land. Mike took the envelope slowly, his fingers feeling the smooth paper as his heart raced. What's this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Open it, Daniel replied, simply. With a hesitant hand, Mike tore open the envelope and pulled out a check. At first glance, it looked ordinary, until he saw the blank space where the amount should have been. His eyes widened in confusion. The check was signed, but the amount, that was up to him. Daniel stood there, watching him with quiet expectation. Write whatever you need, whatever will help you pay off your debts, whatever will give you the opportunity to pursue your dreams. The rest, that's up to you. Mike blinked, his mind spinning. This was too much. A blank check? It felt like a dream, something he couldn't possibly deserve. He stared at the check, his thoughts racing. What should he write? How much was too much? He could clear all his debts, take care of everything, maybe even start over. But something inside him pulled him back, as if the simple act of taking this much would somehow make him lose everything he had worked for. He couldn't bring himself to write a large amount, not when it felt like such an immense gift. Instead, Mike carefully wrote an amount, just enough to clear his debts and to inject some life into his failing business. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything he needed to take a step forward. I can't take more than this, Mike said quietly, pushing the check back toward Daniel. This will be enough. It's all I need for now. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. It's exactly what I expected. You passed the test, Mike, and now it's time to see how you use this second chance. Mike's hands were still trembling as he held the check, unsure whether he had made the right choice or if he was about to walk away from an opportunity he'd never get again. But as Daniel turned to leave, Mike felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Maybe this wasn't about the amount on the check. Maybe it was about the kind of person he was, the choices he had made, and the way he had responded to a simple act of kindness all those years ago. As the sound of Daniel's car engine faded into the distance, Mike stood alone on his driveway, holding a check that could change everything. But for the first time in a long while, he felt certain about something. He was ready to take the next step, whatever it was. Months had passed since Mike made his decision, and his life was no longer the same. His small business, once struggling to stay afloat, was now thriving. The debts that had once felt like an unshakable burden had been cleared, and with the money he had invested, his business was growing faster than he ever imagined. Mike found himself working long hours, but now it was with a sense of purpose and hope for the future. As his business expanded, Mike didn't forget the lesson Daniel had taught him. He understood now that kindness was never truly lost. It had a way of coming back, often in ways you couldn't predict. And just as Daniel had paid it forward to him, Mike found himself in a position to help others. He started giving back to his community, helping people in need, offering jobs to those who were struggling like he once had. It was his way of honoring the kindness that had been shown to him. The ripple effect of one small act of generosity had transformed his life, and now he was creating ripples of his own, touching lives in ways he never thought possible. One late afternoon, as Mike was driving home from work, a familiar feeling swept over him. His eyes caught sight of a figure standing by the side of the road, another hitchhiker, a man with a backpack, looking worn but hopeful. Mike slowed the car down, pulling up beside him. The man glanced over with a hesitant look in his eyes, unsure if he should approach. But Mike simply smiled and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" Mike asked, his voice warm and inviting. The man, surprised, nodded and climbed into the car. As Mike pulled back onto the road, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about helping a stranger. It was about continuing the chain of kindness that had changed his life forever. And as the car moved down the road, Mike felt at peace. The journey that had started with one small act of compassion had come full circle. There was still much to be done, many more lives to touch, but now Mike understood something fundamental. Kindness had the power to create ripples far beyond what we could ever see.